Welcome to the S.O.A.P Bible Study Series from Oak Tree Community Church in South Bend, Indiana. We are near the beginning. This is only week 2 of a series through the books of Judges, and then we'll tack Ruth on at the end as well, because it happens during, in fact, the beginning of Ruth says, during the time of the Judges.
Yeah, nice.
So we don't know exactly when, but at some point, it was during the time of the Judges. But we have to get through Judges first. So
yeah. So last week we started and we got the background, in the time of Judges, what was going on. And I think one of the biggest things that we saw is we saw this repetitive pattern, and we're going to see it more. So we might as well talk about it.
It's the elephant in the room, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it was the people abandon God and start worshiping false idols. Imagine this, God gets mad, bad things happen. People call out, God, help us.
Bad things are happening.
God has mercy and helps, usually in the form of a judge or a deliverer.
Some kind of deliverer, right? Yeah.
Right. And then the people repent, turn back, and then they fall back into disobedience, and it's just a cycle that just keeps happening, and we see it all we see it all over the place.
And we said that it was actually a downward spiral because I think it's chapter 2 says that each generation, each time they did it, they actually got worse. They fell away from God even further. Yep. And so it's not just, here we're doing it again, but we're further and further and further away each time. Right. So watch as you're going through this, that, the judges actually get worse each time. We talked about Othniel, and he was like Caleb's blood relative. We're going to run into some judges going further and further down that we're like, I don't think he was as good as that guy was.
Right.
That's true.
Right. So last week we kind of focused on Deborah and Barak. Mm-hmm. I think I finally said it right. Yeah, good for me. They were featured prominently, and then this week we start with chapter 5, and it's a song.
It's a pickup from that.
It's a song from last week. So it's like a recap of last week in chapter 5. So it's kind of cool. And like Deborah said, if you involve me with this, you're going to take second billing. Yeah. And we see that in the song too.
What I like is verse 2, the very beginning of this song. It says, most translations are going to say something along the lines of, when the leaders took the lead. And that was the whole thing.
Right. You would expect them to take the lead,
but they weren't.
Right.
Yeah.
So Deborah had to step in.
Yeah. So she was out there doing her thing, and she was a prophetess, so God was using her, but she was also having to lead in a role she wasn't supposed to lead in, and she, called him out on the fact that he wasn't stepping up. I love the song. It's when they finally took the lead.
Things happen. Yeah. So at the end of the song, we find that the land had rest for 40 years. Yeah. And that's another way to say they were with God, in touch. Yeah. For 40 years.
40 years.
Right. So that's the end of a cycle, right? So a deliverer was raised. They did something spectacular that they never should have had to do in the first place. Right. Which is, good for them. And now the people are like, let's not forget.
Well, and you make a good point, because really, if you think about it, had the people been following God and following the priests and everything when Joshua died, the way God had intended for them to do, the book of Judges never should have happened. Right. This whole book we should just be able to take out of the Bible, and none of these things happen. Of course, they didn't, and so now we've got 40 years. That's a generation.
Yeah.
So that now we've got a new generation that is going to start this cycle.
Verse 6, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's sight. Yeah, on chapter 6. Yeah. So the Lord turned over to Midian for 7 years, right? So it's the start of another cycle in 6. And so the deal here's how bad it was. The Israelites had to plant crops in secret and do things in secret, because anytime they did anything, the Midianites, the Amalekites, and people from the east would attack them.
And it says that they devoured the crops, they left nothing, they took away the sheep, the oxen, and the donkeys. They invaded, and they were thick as locusts. I mean, it's like you can see this swarm of enemies just eating everything, devouring everything in sight, and when they're done, the Israelites are looking around like,
Yeah, what are we going to do?
in
Yeah,
the
what are we
world
going to
just
eat?
happened? Yeah.
Yeah. So we see that an angel of the Lord came to Gideon, and Gideon was actually threshing wheat in a wine press.
Yep.
And you're like, what?
Yeah.
And it tells you why, right?
Yeah.
So he could hide.
He's hiding.
Hide from the Midianites.
Just try to keep some food.
Right. So this guy is hiding. He is thrashing some food. He's trying to get some wheat.
Yeah.
Trying to get some food. And an angel of the Lord said to him, "The Lord is with you, courageous warrior."
Right.
And Gideon says, "Pardon me." I love that. Pardon me.
What?
Objection.
Objection. He's looking at, who are you talking to?
Yeah.
Well, I'm hiding.
Yeah.
And you're calling me courageous warrior.
Right. But if the Lord is with us, why has such disaster overtaken us? I mean, great
Sounds
great
like
line
a good
there.
question.
Yeah, exactly. So we would say now in our age, anytime we see the angel of the Lord, we would take that to be what we call the pre-incarnate Jesus.
Right.
So Jesus wasn't Jesus till he became Jesus, a man, and came as a baby.
Right, but he's
and this is, but he was always there.
always the Son of God.
Yeah.
He's the eternal Son of God. And so before he became human, his incarnation.
Yeah.
So,
that's
I
why we call
him
pre-
pre-Jesus.
Yeah, right. So just so everybody's,
Yeah,
because some
this is
people
God.
take, not that they take offense to call him
Right.
Jesus, but
Yeah.
he's not Jesus yet.
He's not Jesus technically yet because that's his human name,
right.
but he is God. He's always been God.
Yep.
And sometimes this translation, angel of the Lord, makes us think somebody less than God.
Yeah,
This is God who showed up.
right.
Yeah.
And sometimes the angel of the Lord definitely speaks as God too.
Yeah.
I mean, you can tell. It's like, whoa.
Yeah. My covenant. We saw
Yeah,
that last
yeah,
time, right?
yeah, exactly.
My covenant with you. He accepts sacrifices. He accepts offerings. He accepts worship that angels never do. Right.
Yeah. So Jesus tells Gideon, "Hey, you're going to deliver the whole nation from the Midianites." And Gideon says, "I need a sign."
Yeah.
Right? He's not necessarily testing God because at this point he wasn't even aware that this was God.
He didn't know.
Yeah.
Right.
Right. Yeah, I need a sign. So he said he would go and prepare food.
Yeah.
So he goes and prepares a goat, and there's broth and whatever
How
else.
long does it take to prepare that? I mean, was the goat already on the spit? This was going to be tonight's supper. Did he have to go slaughter it, skin it? I mean, the whole thing.
That's the way. Right.
That's how I've always read
It's
it.
not going to take a half hour.
Right. I mean, it's like, wait here till I get back. It's like half a day.
Probably more. Right? So they put it out. Jesus burns it up.
Yeah.
And that's when Gideon goes, "Oh."
You're not just some guy. I thought you were just a traveler who walked by.
I now have a sign. Yeah. So,
And then disappears, by the way. He doesn't just burn it up.
right.
He burns it up by touching it with his staff. He's like, boop. And it goes whoosh. And then he disappears.
yeah. So Gideon now knows it was God, and God tells him, "Hey, you need to take down all these idol worshiping things in your village."
Yeah.
And so Gideon's like, "Okay, I'll do it at night."
Tonight.
Which
After
give him
everybody's
credit.
asleep,
Yeah,
you know.
but give him credit for it.
At least he did it.
Yeah. So the townspeople wanted to kill Gideon, and Gideon's dad comes back with a great thing, saying, "Whoa, whoa, whoa. If Gideon upset the god Baal, let Baal take care of it.
Take care of it
Yeah,
himself.
he should enact the punishment."
Right.
What? Your God can't fight his own battles?
Yeah.
It's like, ooh, that's excellent.
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. And even nicknamed him, the guy who fights with Baal.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's never a good idea to test God. And then Gideon tested God.
Again.
And now he's going to, 2 more times.
Right.
He's gonna, or at least twice.
So the first time makes sense. Didn't know it was God. He didn't know he's just like some guy, doesn't even make sense. That one makes sense. This one, I've always had sort of an issue with.
Yeah. And it's fleece a bowl and dew. And the idea is I'm going to put the bowl, I'm going to put some fleece in it. One time I want you to make it wet. The other time I want you to make it dry and the surrounding area wet.
So it makes sense.
So-
So you put out this fleece and you're like, okay, I want, tonight I want the ground around it to be dry, but the fleece to be wet. And you wake up in the next morning and it is. And you're
Right.
like, well, that's stupid. It could have just soaked it up. Okay, let's do it the other way.
let's flip it.
Everything else is wet, but that stays dry. that one's sort of miraculous, right?
Yeah.
You was so. But still, you're right. It's like, should he be testing God? You hear people today say, "Oh, I'm going to put out a fleece." That's where the phrase comes from. I'm going to put out a fleece for God. It's like, well, this is where it comes from. Number one.
Yeah.
Number two.
Yeah, it doesn't. Right. But God didn't have a problem with it.
Yeah.
And in fact, we'll see one more time.
Yeah. But see,
but
that's
offered to him.
Yeah, the next time God says, you know what? I'm going to give you a sign. Yeah. I didn't even ask. I know. That's okay. I'm going to give you one anyway.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know if this is... I'll just be honest. I have a hard time with this.
I don't disagree with that.
I don't have a hard time with it with Gideon necessarily. I do have a hard time with it today.
With us saying, "Hey, since Gideon did it, I get to do it."
Yeah,
too.
yeah. That's a little bit. I have a little bit tougher time. You know, I'm waiting for a sign from God.
Okay, so Gideon's got to raise an army.
Yeah.
And he's got to go beat the bad guys.
Yeah.
And so he raises an army of 32,000
32,000 guys who are willing to fight.
Yep. And God says, no, it's too many.
Which is interesting because when we get the number later, it's more than 130,000 in the army that they're fighting.
Yeah, so even off the bat,
he was still, only a quarter of the way or something.
Right. Right. So God said you need to reduce it. And makes sense from our standpoint, understanding that this is going to be a God thing that happens, not a man thing.
I don't want you guys thinking that you were strong enough to do this. I want you to know I did it.
Yeah. So
I love the first one.
They said, all right, if you're scared, you get to go home.
That's right.
22,000.
22,000 out of 32,000. They're like, oh, okay. I'm scared. I'm going home.
Yeah, so 2/3 went home.
Yeah.
Then it was like, hey, everybody go get a drink of water. And if you lap like a dog versus put it in your hands, I think they picked the dogs.
Yeah, right.
Anyways, they end up with 300 men.
300 out of 32,000.
Yep. And everybody got a trumpet.
And a fire stick.
Yeah.
And a clay jar.
So
I'm not seeing swords. I'm not seeing bows
so
and
Gideon was like, okay, you're going to attack this army, and like you said, God also said, go take a look at them. Yeah. At first, so he went down and spied on them, and he heard the other army was kind of freaking out.
Yeah. Somehow they had heard about Gideon, and they had heard about this army that he was amassing. I don't know if they heard. That people were going back home.
Right. Right. Now, I think it's also important to note that this army is really three armies that kind of are together.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure how well they knew each other. And I think that plays into it.
Yeah,
too.
so they were definitely part of the same region. So you've talked about Midianites, you've talked about Amalekites, plus others.
Yeah, others from the east or whatever it was. Right.
So God said, are you scared, Gideon? Yeah, I am. Do you want a sign? Well, I don't need one. Well, I'm going to give you one anyway. Well, that's nice.
Yeah.
So he goes down. He hears these two guys talking. One of them says, oh, I have this dream about this barley roll, which is really interesting. This barley roll comes into our camp and just knocks everything over. Barley is the food of the poorest of the poor.
Right.
It's what you feed your animals, and it's what you eat if you don't have anything else. Which, there's Gideon. That's Israel right now, right?
Right.
And the other guy's like, that means Gideon's going to win. How do you get Gideon's going to win out of a barley roll knocks over your tent? Okay.
Was he right or wrong? So he knew, right?
He was right. So somehow God was letting them know. I'm not sure all the details how, but it was enough for Gideon to say, hey.
Well, and I think the key, too, is there was some fear that was instilled into the people.
Yeah.
So Gideon, with his 300, he breaks them into 3 units of 100. They, quote, surround the army, at least on 3 sides. And at the appointed time, they're blowing their trumpets, and they had light that they could turn around.
Yeah, they broke a pot. They made a lot of noise. They yelled.
Yeah.
And they sounded like they were surrounded.
Right. And that was it. And then the army started fighting themselves, which I take to be one group was fighting another group, and they just they easily mistake them for
It was overnight.
Israel.
They couldn't
Yep.
see. All they knew is that they were surrounded, and all of a sudden they've got people they can't see, they don't recognize invading their camp.
Right.
They're
Probably
going to kill
speaking
people.
a different language.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Which is awesome.
Yeah.
Right.
So it was obviously a God thing, just like
Yeah.
he said.
Yeah. So the world's great. We get into chapter 8, and now the Ephraimites are mad.
Which, these are Israelites from the tribe of Ephraim, and what are they mad about?
They weren't invited to the party. They wanted to fight.
Why didn't you ask
And
us
they
to
waited
fight
till
me?
after it was over and the good side won
Yeah.
to say we're mad. And mad enough that they were going to start a war
Yeah.
with them.
Now, in the meantime, what had happened is the Midianite generals, right? The Midianite, does it say kings or the generals, had run away, and the Ephraimites had captured them and killed them. That's how they knew what was going on. Gideon, smooth,
Yeah.
really smooth. He's like, but you killed what did we accomplish that was anything like what you accomplished? You guys got to kill the generals.
Yeah.
We just stood by and let everybody else kill each other.
Plus, it wasn't even us. God did it.
God did it, yeah. And the Ephraimites like, that's true. We killed the generals. Okay, all right, we're cool with that.
Yep.
It's like, oh please.
Yeah, so when they were trying to fight these guys, right? They went across the Jordan. So the 300 followed, right? They had to be tired at that time.
Yeah.
They went into 2 towns or areas and asked for food,
Yeah.
and both of them refused.
Well, and what's interesting is that these towns, even though they were across the Jordan, if you remember your Jewish history, 2.5 tribes stayed on the west side or the east side of the Jordan River. So they were still in Israelite territory. These were fellow Jews, fellow Israelites who were saying, no, we're not going to give you food, even though our common enemies are running through our towns, running through our territory. You're hunting them down. We're still not going to help you. These weren't enemies. They were fellow Israelites.
Yeah, like didn't want to be part of it.
Yeah.
Right, it was just kind of amazing.
Yeah.
So at the end of the day, everybody was caught.
Yeah.
Everybody died. A huge victory for Gideon. They, of course, want to make Gideon king.
Yeah.
And Gideon says, no, but I will take some earrings.
Yeah. So it really does, his story does sort of end on a down,
Yeah. Yeah, so it was certainly great. I mean, he could have been the king. I can see choosing not to, but he asked for all the earrings that showed up in the plunder, and assuming the army, everybody wore an earring.
Yeah.
So he had a bunch of gold,
a lot of gold,
and he melted it down into an ephod.
Yeah, and ephod.
Ephod. So that was generally worn by
the high priest.
By the high priest, is the garment that kind of slipped on. Think about like a breastplate.
Yeah.
And certainly at the time of Moses, there was either 4 or 5 areas that had specific jewels or whatever in there.
Yeah.
And the problem we find out later is that this symbol of the victory then became an idol.
Yeah.
And people started worshiping it.
Yeah. So exactly what they were supposed to be coming out of is, he said, no, I'm not going to be the king, but I'm going to take loot. And it says, in addition to the gold, there was other stuff that he took. And so he made himself rich as the ruler, as the judge, wouldn't call himself king, which we'll find out later was not exactly true. And he made this thing which he never should have had, was only the priests were supposed to have, and he kept it, and that is what led Israel back into idolatry.
Yeah. So for 40 years, the land was at rest, which is a good. So if we're on the cycle, God brought up a deliverer, good things happened. Now the land's at the rest. Gideon has 70 sons at that time, and he died as an old age, and then Israel started worshiping Baal again.
Yeah. Yep.
So kind of an interesting end to the story, and next chapter is the next page.
Yeah.
Right, and it's dealing with one of the sons.
One of the sons, yeah. It really, like we said, we're doing this downward spiral. So, the last time it ended pretty well. This time it ended okay, but with a problem.
Right.
So each time, not only does it begin lower, but it ends lower. It's not as big of a victory. It's not as big of a woohoo.
Yeah. Well, and next time is really ugly.
Yeah, and it just keeps getting worse. Each time it's going to get worse. So, sadly, we don't get to end on as high of a note as last. Yeah, Gideon's a great judge. He helps deliver the people, but it's not as big as it could have been, should have been.
Right.
And that's going to be the story of the judges over and over. But yeah, that's where we end. Hopefully you enjoy the read. You can see some parallels between what they did and, where churches go, where nations go. The further you go away from God, it takes longer to get back or whatever, and you come back just a little bit, but not all the way.
Right.
And then, what do they say? One step forward, two steps back almost, right?
Yeah,
so
exactly.
That's really where we're going here. If you have questions or comments, we'd love to field those for you. Send them our way. Please make sure that you've subscribed, you forward this on to people that you think would benefit, would enjoy it. And we will see you back here next time. And we're actually going to pick up with Gideon's family again and just keep going.
Bye, everybody.